Our next speaker was to be Steve O'Brien, and I had talked with Steve, and he very graciously offered to join us today. That was the first time I talked to Steve, and he was very excited about this appearing here. And many of you have read his material in the magazine, I'm sure, the interesting biographies that he writes about some of the lesser-known Catholic heroes who really are quite fascinating lives to consider. But anyway, Steve called this morning at the hotel right here where I was staying. I thought it was probably the wake-up call or something, and it was a wake-up call of sorts. It was Steve telling me that he had contracted the flu yesterday. He told his wife that he was going to come here anyway. He started driving on the freeway, and he had to stop. And then he had to go a little further on the freeway, and he had to stop. And then he had to stop and make a call. He's very genuinely regretful that he can't be here. And so we turned to one of our stalwarts who has written many articles in our magazine, the Latin Mass magazine, and he answered the call. He is a graduate of the Fordham University Law School, and he is currently president of the American Catholic Lawyers Association, and I'm sure many of you know of his work. He has led the charge on many major pro-life cases and has had remarkable outcomes from his efforts. He was, I found this out about him some time ago. He's an excellent author as well as a speaker. He co-authored a book called The Great Facade, which I think many of you have read, and if not, there are copies of it available out there. He also did a book on EWTN, which is quite interesting, and I would recommend that as reading for you also, and that's on sale out in the lobby. I found out once that when he was 17 years old, that he was mugged in a New York subway. So that means that he's aptly prepared and conditioned to speak to a group of traditional Catholics. He certainly knows what it is to be mugged. And so I introduce to you, with gratitude for his coming today, Chris Ferrara. Chris, thank you. We called the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops today in an effort to see who they might have available on their speaking panel. And then we called EWTN after that to frantically see who they might have available. And both of them recommended Chris as the speaker.
Thank you. They recommended me knowing that I was totally unprepared. It turns out that this talk will dovetail to some extent with Father Goodman's talk. And I'm going to take a look at what he was discussing under a somewhat different aspect. Because what we have seen in the church in the past 40 years is not just an attack on our holy religion, but an attack on reason itself and on the nature of man as a substance. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I have about a half an hour to basically give you the history of what went wrong in the world since the time of the Greeks. So let's have a go at it. And when I say that we're talking about an attack on reason, I mean what the Pope meant when he discussed this whole crisis involving the severance of faith from reason. Because the Greeks understood, even without revelation, that man is a substance. He is made for a certain end. He is a unity of body and soul, and that the soul is his highest faculty. And because he has a soul, because that soul is united to his body, he was made for a certain end, which is the perfection of virtue which resides in the soul. And as Aristotle teaches us, nature does nothing uselessly. Everything has an end, and man has an end. That end is endowed to him in his soul, which he is to perfect. That is the aim of human existence, perfection of man in virtue. The only thing the Greeks didn't understand was the superaddition of the theological virtues. But everything in nature has an end. And let me illustrate this with a concrete example. This this container has an end. It contains liquids, wine or milk. But suppose this container were to speak to us one day, and it were to say to us something like, I'm tired of being a container for liquids, especially milk at these boring Catholic conferences. I would like to be a hammer. And we would say to the little container, no, little container, you cannot be a hammer. You were designed to hold liquids. If you try to be a hammer, you will destroy yourself. That is not the end for which you were made. But the little container insists on being a hammer. I've got to be me. And what I want to be is a hammer, and he proceeds, this container proceeds to attempt to be a hammer and destroys itself. Well, when man ignores his end, acts contrary to his end, he destroys himself no less certainly than that. And the Greeks understood this without even the light of revelation. And they understood that man is a social animal. He was made to live in political society, and that the function of political society, given the ends of man, is to perfect man in virtue through the influence of suitable laws. They also understood that public worship was a necessity in the commonwealth to which man was ordained. In the Greeks and the pagan Romans alike would have considered it absolute madness to deny the necessity of public worship. And so for the Greeks, the common good was that good by which men share in the life of society, a society ordered to the perfection of each individual man, and the good of the society was the ultimate good, which is the embrace of God. The Greeks understood that the highest activity of man is the contemplation of God. And Plato, read together with Aristotle, leads us to see that even they understood, and Augustine marveled at this, and the Christians of his day marveled at it, that the Greeks recognized the end of man is to achieve, to the extent possible, union with God. And the function of society is to assist man in that union. And so the rational superstructure of society existed long before Christians began to philosophize about politics. And from the very first signs we see of the Christian commonwealth, even, for example, in the Theodosian Code, we see a society ordered according to the end of man as a creature of God. So the Theodosian Code, just to give one small example, had Sunday closing laws. Society was organized, even Bergen County today has these laws, to remind man of his eternal destiny and to give due worship to God by not allowing commerce on Sunday, by punishing public heresy, by providing for public worship. You see this from the very earliest days of Christian civilization, which brings into Cardinal Ratzinger's comment. This was from the famous Regensburg address that brought the entire Muslim world down on his head. And he said the following: this inner rapprochement between biblical faith and Greek philosophical inquiry was an event of decisive importance, not only from the standpoint of the history of religions, but also from that of the world of world history. It is an event which concerns us even today. Given this convergence, it is not surprising that Christianity, despite its origins and some significant developments in the East, finally took on its historically decisive character in Europe. You can also express this the other way around. This convergence, with the subsequent addition of the Roman heritage, created Europe and remains the foundation of what can rightly be called Europe. And then he goes on to say, in all honesty, one must observe that in the late Middle Ages we find trends in theology which would sunder this synthesis between the Greek spirit and the Christian spirit. End quote. He was talking in a diplomatic way about Martin Luther, the son of liberalism, just as the devil is the son of perdition. And what Machiavelli only hoped for, Luther did. He put into motion this great rebellion against the Catholic Church that had brought the world to the brink of an apocalypse. And since the time of Luther, what we have seen at work are two processes in the Western mind. The immanentization of the mind, it's a big fancy word for remaining within, the immanentization of thought accompanied by the atomization of political society. So man retreats within his own mind while society subdivides into innumerable individuals. And the whole notion of the common good, the ordination of man to a political society which leads man to God, is lost. And Father Ripperger gave a talk on this not too long ago. And he shows how this whole twin process began with what he calls the Cartesian cogito. You have to understand a little bit about Descartes in order to understand what went wrong with Western man. The cogito is Descartes' solution to the skepticism that reigned everywhere because of the Protestant revolt. He said, I have to retreat into my own mind. Everything has been cast into a state of uncertainty. But what I do know is that I think. And so if I can put together a chain of thoughts that seems reasonable to me, that is the beginning of knowledge in this age of uncertainty. And as he put it, and I'm quoting the famous passage, but I immediately realized that though I wanted to think that everything was false, it was necessary that the me who was doing the thinking was something. And noticing this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and sure that all the wildest suppositions of skeptics could not shake it, I judged that I could unhesitatingly accept it as the first principle of the philosophy for which I was seeking, end quote. Now, Father Rippinger and Cornelio Fabreau, in his huge and monumental study of this whole subject, shows that the cogito was the beginning of disaster. Because when man says, knowledge begins with what I can put together in here, instead of what is out there, when man no longer says, I apprehend the thing as it is, based upon the external being of that thing. When he says, no, my search for what I know begins in here, through the assembly of a chain of what seem to me reasonably connected thoughts, we no longer understand what being is. Everything becomes locked up in our heads, not only politics, but religion. Everything, all thought processes become subjectivized. And Fabreau calls this the indifferent neglect of being. That is what underlies the processes, the immanentization of the human mind. We no longer really care what is. We care about what we think. And that leads us to the founder of modern political philosophy, Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was the philosopher for the era of Protestant chaos. The Protestant revolt had cast the truths of revelation into doubt. All society was descending into chaos. There was a multiplication of sects. So Hobbes comes along in the midst of all this turmoil. And let's remember the time in which Hobbes wrote. Charles I had been overthrown. They put the king on trial for treason and executed him. And Cromwell replaces him and becomes, of course, an absolute dictator. Then Cromwell falls, and they install Charles II. He becomes the king after they dig up Cromwell's body and hang him posthumously. Then Charles's brother, James II, who had the temerity to convert to Roman Catholicism, eventually becomes king, the last Catholic king of England, and he's overthrown by the rent-a-king, William of Orange, and the reign of William and Mary begins. This was insanity. And Hobbes, stepping into this context of revolution inspired by the Protestant revolt, says what we need to quell this chaos is an absolute sovereign. We need the great Leviathan. The Leviathan will restore order. The Leviathan will end the war of each against all in his mythical state of nature and give society the order that it needs. And this Leviathan will tell us not only what the laws in civil society are, but also what will constitute the canons of sacred scripture. And as C.B. McPherson has noted, and I'm quoting, Hobbes was the first political philosopher to break away from the traditional reliance on a supposed will or purpose in the universe. When looking at man and political society, we no longer say, like this container, that it's designed for a certain end, that man can't alter his end, and that end is to be united with God, and that civil society is to lead us to that union to the extent that civil society can do that within the sphere of its competence. We no longer say that. For Hobbes, man is reduced to animality. His private religious beliefs are one thing, but we need to look at the common denominator by which men can be governed in the new social order. And that common denominator is man's desire for self-preservation. He escapes the state of nature, which is a war of each against all, to preserve his life. And the function of society is to help man preserve his life against the claims of other men. And for Hobbes, man is a machine in motion. He had this kind of Newtonian conception of political society because we no longer think about the spiritual side of man, thanks to the Protestant revolt. We look at man as a machine. All of these machines are competing for available resources. They're trying to steal each other's stuff and kill each other. So we need the Leviathan to adjudicate the claims and adjust the motions of the machines and maintain order in political society. And that's the Hobbesian conception. Men are basically bodies in motion. And we have a scientific conception of man's nature, which denies his end in God. And the sovereign that he had in mind replaces papal authority. Whereas the Pope was a check on political authority in pre-Reformation social order, we no longer have a Pope. In fact, the Pope's authority is positively rejected. Who will take the place of the Pope in matters of religion? The all-powerful Leviathan, the Hobbesian sovereign. And for Hobbes, public morality then is reduced to peacekeeping. The Greek conception of political society, which has been allied to the Catholic conception and gave us Christendom, as Cardinal Ratzinger noted, is gone. And the function of government is peacekeeping. And as Leo Strauss has pointed out, this whole idea of political society arises from what he calls the loss of the fear of invisible powers. Men no longer fear God. You're either saved or you're not saved. And if you're saved, well, that's fine. But you can't earn your salvation. Grace doesn't enter into this. If you're one of the elect, you'll be saved. And fear of the invisible powers comes out of the equation for social organization. We don't need society to get us to heaven through assisting the church through the legal system. Man has an individual relation to God, and that's a private matter. Now, well, the only thing we fear in political society is physical death or the theft of our possessions, which brings us quickly to John Locke. Locke is supposedly the kinder, gentler Hobbes, the new improved Hobbes. For him, we don't have the absolute Leviathan, we have the supreme legislature to whose authority we consent. But at the end of the analysis, Locke is really saying the same thing as Hobbes. Our consent to this supreme legislature is irrevocable, unless we have grounds for overthrowing it because we're dissatisfied with what we perceive to be a tyrannical regime. Although Hobbes said pretty much the same thing. Within certain limits, revolution is justified even in the Hobbesian scheme. Where for Locke, we have the supreme legislature, which does pretty much what the Leviathan does. Keep order, keep the machines in motion from colliding with each other. And basically, in Locke's system, there's an emphasis on property rights. Political society is organized so that man can acquire and defend and maintain his property without limitation. Now, Locke tried to argue that man is wholly rational and peaceable by nature, unlike like Hobbes. But in the end, he really says the same thing Hobbes is saying. There's a state of nature. Men are warring with each other. They have to get out of it. So by agreement, they form a political society. Man is not ordained to political society by God. Political society doesn't have the end of perfecting man in virtue and leading him to God. It's a mere convention that men enter into to protect themselves and to defend their property against violation by others. So this is what we have. We have in the Hobbesian Lockean system an arena of machines in motion using government for the limited purpose of protecting property. But what about religion? Well, Locke introduced the foundation of modern social order where religion is concerned. He called it his law of toleration. And as he expressed it in his letter on toleration, every man is orthodox to himself, and every church is orthodox to itself. And so we have all of these competing claims of orthodoxy, both personal and organizational. What can political society do now that the Protestant revolt has shattered it into 1,000 pieces? Well, we have to have the law of toleration. And Locke was at pains to note that, of course, Catholics, as he put it in his essay on toleration, cannot be the benefit of this law. Because these Catholics, you see, when they become the majority, they try to revert to this original conception of the state, which is that there should be public worship. The state is ordered to the good of man, including his eternal good. The civil law should work in conjunction with divine law to perfect man in virtue and lead him to heaven. That's what Catholics do when they become the majority. They establish a Catholic confessional state. And we can't have that. And so Catholics cannot be extended the benefits of the law of toleration. Unless, of course, they're willing to renounce this claim of the church that the ideal for man is public worship as the Greeks recognized. The only difference being that in the Catholic conception, that public worship is Catholic worship. Now, Locke denied that God implants the natural law in man's soul. There is a natural law, he would say, his own conception of it, but we discover it through the exercise of our reason, and we need to have it taught to us. And we explore and find out what the natural law is, but it's not implanted in our soul. And here we see already the attack on substance. That man has a soul endowed with the recognition of the natural law. Pierre Manent has written extensively on this whole idea of the nature of man. Yes, man has a soul, although Hobbes laughed at the idea of an immaterial soul. He has a soul, he has a nature, but we really don't know too much about that. It's disputed. But what we do know is that man has rights. He has the right to property, he has the right to self-preservation, he has the right to life. And in terms of our natural law philosophy, that's about it. The rest of what man is in this X quantity, which is now in dispute. And we can't talk too much about substance beyond these rights, because once we get beyond rights into the final end of man as a creature destined for eternal beatitude, guess what? We've opened ourselves up to the claims of those Romanists. And we have to go back to the conception of society as a moral totality, organized to bring man to heaven, assisting the church in that endeavor. We can't have that because Protestant sects don't agree on this anymore. And so society can no longer reflect that Catholic conception. And so the substance of man, his soul, his ordination to eternal light, grace and the sacraments as necessary to the perfection of the soul, and laws within civil society which aid the church in getting grace to man in its mission on earth, all of that goes out with the whole conception of man as a substance with an immortal soul destined for eternal beatitude. And as Manent points out, modern political philosophy, which is liberalism, is an attack on substance. Man is no longer seen as a fixed and sempiternal substance created by God, just as surely as this thing is created for one and only one end. So, for Locke, and for modern political philosophy as a whole, as I said, society exists to adjudicate conflicts. And basically, those conflicts involve property rights. And the Lockean conception of society is, let us face it, the American conception. And the ethics involved is a consequentialist ethics. Locke says, in the state of nature, you can only take what you need. If you take too much, you've spoiled things. You've wasted them. And that's a crime against nature. But in political society, with the advent of money, man can heap to himself an unlimited amount of wealth because of monetary exchange and give it away and get money in return. So there's a real limit in political society on the acquisition of wealth. You can become as rich as it is possible for a man to be, rich beyond any necessity for yourself and your family. And the poor, well, they benefit because the richer the rich get, at least the poor live off the subsistence that falls to them like crumbs from the table. And so it's a consequentialist ethics. The greatest good for the greatest number of people is the ethic of modern political society. It doesn't matter what A does to B, what the rich man does to the poor man. All that matters is that the invisible hand of Adam Smith produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people by allowing the rich to become rich and the poor to get whatever they get. And you'll see it's a bit of a circular argument. It's entirely a circular argument. The invisible hand produces the status quo, and the status quo is good because that is what the invisible hand produced. Well, the liberal political philosophy is basically a defense of the status quo of a capitalist social order that has thrown off all connection to the Catholic Church. And the capitalist social order operates not only in the realm of economics, but in the realm of interpersonal exchanges, speech, all forms of human conduct become subject to the market principle. Whatever two adults consent to is fine as long as they're not violating each other's rights. And rights are tendentiously defined to mean basically whatever you'd like to do that doesn't interfere with someone else's rights. And again, the whole concept of man as a substance has gone out the window. We no longer care about what man is and where he's heading to. And what all of this means, and Father Goodwin touched on this, is that the idea that man is fallen, that because of original sin, he has suffered defects in will and reason, and that without grace to elevate him above the state of his fallen nature, he will sin and society will collapse into a state of chaos and sin. That is gone. For liberal political philosophy, to the Lockean society, original sin no longer enters into the picture. In fact, let me correct myself. Original sin is the foundation of Lockean political society, implicitly. They don't acknowledge the doctrine of original sin. But what they're really saying is we take fallen man as a given. That's it. We work with him. And the good society is that which accommodates fallen man to the extent of not allowing one fallen man to kill another fallen man or take his stuff. It's an adjudication of conflict between fallen men. The idea of man as a substance, as a human soul, enlivened by grace and elevated above his fallen nature, is gone, completely gone. And so the attack on substance is the foundation. And if you look at Hobbes in his Leviathan, he has a whole chapter ridiculing, at the end of Leviathan, ridiculing scholastic philosophy, ridiculing the idea that man is a soul united to a physical body, ridiculing the idea that when the body dies, the soul is separated from that body, ridiculing, in fact, every teaching of the Catholic Church in this chapter and the final chapter of Leviathan, because he recognized the intrinsic link between scholastic philosophy, which is based on Greek philosophy, the idea of man as substance with an endowed end and an immortal soul, and Catholic dogma. And he knew that the two of them had combined to give us, as Cardinal Ratzinger recognized, Christian social order, this unity of faith and reason had given us Christendom. And the attack of the liberals, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and all the rest of them, was an attack on this unity of faith and reason. So where does that leave us? It leaves us, as Father Goodwin was talking about, with this new idea of modern man. Now, I would urge you to get a book. Go home today, go on the internet, go to Amazon and order City of Man by Pierre Manent, Manent. It's a short but very difficult text. You've got to read it several times to get the full benefits of it. But it's a work of genius, because Manent has exposed the fraud that modernity is with a profundity that I don't think has been seen by any writer in the 20th or even in this century. Manent has recognized that with the advent of liberal political philosophy, with the destruction of this whole conception of man as substance, we have a new kind of man, modern man, and we have a new law for man, not natural law, not divine law, but history. Man is now subject to the law of history. He lives in history, and the mere progression of time and developments within society become his law. As Manent puts it, who can resist the demands of the present time? Another way he describes it is the authority of the new, because we've been cast off from all connection with the Greco-Roman Catholic tradition. Because man is no longer a substance, he floats along in history, and he's subject to the law of history. And it's this law of history that Gaudium et Spes attempted to reconcile with Catholic teaching. Now, Father said he did not want to disparage the documents of Vatican II and Gaudium et Spes in particular. Well, I do. I'm a layman, and I have that freedom. Not only that, Cardinal Ratzinger, back when he was Father Ratzinger in 1967, was quite disparaging of Gaudium et Spes. He wrote a commentary on it, and he said that the document was unsatisfactory because, among other things, it was not at all prepared to recognize sin as the center of the theological edifice. And he also said that the document was unsatisfactory because in its treatment of the relation between grace and free will, particularly in section 17, he said it was downright Pelagian. This is Father Ratzinger speaking about Gaudium et Spes. Now, of course, you can give these documents a traditional interpretation, and I suppose that will be forthcoming someday. And maybe even Cardinal Ratzinger himself is trying to turn the ship around on the problematical documents of Vatican II. But the amazing thing about Gaudium et Spes, and the theologian Tracy Rowland of Australia has recognized this, is that it opened the door to a Catholic acceptance of the idea that there could be such a thing as a modern man who was objectively different from his predecessors. But the very idea that there could be a modern man who was something other than man as substance is destructive of all philosophy. It's destructive of our understanding of human nature. It's destructive of the idea that man has an eternally endowed end to be with God, and that the church will get him there. And yet, here we have a council opening the door to this idea. Gaudium et Spes says at one point that, I'm quoting, Thus, the human race has passed from a rather static concept of reality to a more dynamic evolutionary one. Groovy. I mean, this is an ecumenical council saying that man, the human race, has passed from a rather static concept of reality. How could there be anything other than a static concept of reality? The real does not change. Man does not change. Some externals may change, some gadgets may change. The way we sin may change, even if the sins themselves are different. But man does not change. Reality does not change. To say that there is a static concept of reality being replaced by an evolutionary one is to make thought itself impossible. How can we make any definite statement against modernity if we have now entered into an evolutionary concept of reality? That one statement alone is a keg of TNT aimed directly at the traditional philosophy. And Tracy Rowland, in her analysis of Gaudium et Spes, rightly takes the council to task for having opened the door with these ambiguities. She also says that the council failed to recognize that modernity is itself a cultural formation. It pretends to be neutral, but it is itself a cultural formation that supplants the tradition, the Greco-Roman Christian tradition, with its own formation of culture. And that liberal culture is intrinsically hostile to the Hellenistic Christianity that Cardinal Ratzinger warns the passing of. And the council was naive, she says, about modern culture, and was, we have to say it, incompetent, culturally incompetent, in failing to recognize that modernity was itself a cultural formation hostile to Christian culture. And so now what we have is this bizarre enterprise of the Catholic Church still attempting to reconcile itself to a culture that is implacably hostile to her. And I think the present Pope is beginning to recognize that this fraud can't go on any longer. And yet he isn't willing, yet at least, to say that the only prescription for the problem is the reconstitution of Christendom. But more and more scholars are beginning to say this. It isn't just crackpot traditionalists who have come to the conclusion that modernity is a fraud, that the only salvation for the West is a return to something resembling Christendom. Aidan Nichols, for example, in his book Christendom Awake, is no traditionalist, but he has said, look, it's our only chance for the salvation of the West. Our only chance is the reconstitution of something like Christian social order, which is the only thing, when you get right down to it, that is consistent with what reason tells us, what even the Greeks recognized about the proper organization of society. The current principles on which this civilization is based are nonsensical. Because the law of toleration, which is the foundation of our social order, says that matters of faith and morals are in the realm of personal opinion. So all matters of faith and morals, being personal opinions, must be tolerated, even if they contradict each other. But the law of toleration itself is a definitive opinion on faith and morals, which is a super dogma. Someone decided that all matters of faith and morals are matters of personal opinion, and that the absolute truth about these things is not knowable. How would we know that? Unless we have the capability of making a determination from an objective viewpoint that these are all matters of opinion and that the truth is not knowable with any certainty. The very proposition that the truth is not knowable with certainty is a truth certainly known by the proponent. So our entire social order is based upon a nonsensical principle, which is why, as I say, the reconstruction of Christendom, which basically restores us to the sane recognition that there is only one truth in matters of faith and morals, is essential to the survival of our civilization. And not just Catholic scholars, but even non-Catholics are recognizing this. You may have heard of the radical orthodoxy movement, in which scholars like John Milbank and Catherine Pickstock, who are both Anglicans, are calling for an end to liberalism. It's that simple. We will not survive unless liberalism ends. Now, let me conclude, since I'm pinch-hitting and I've been told to keep it short, with an answer to the obvious question. Well, how is this going to happen? This is so impractical. You're talking about pie in the sky. This is the social order we had. And we can't expect to change it because obviously people aren't going to convert to Catholicism, which is the only way that Christendom can be reconstituted. Well, we're dealing with God, his son, and our Blessed Mother. We're dealing, as Donoso Cortez wrote in his discussion of the necessity of a return to Christendom, we're dealing with a continuing miracle. Christendom was a continuing miracle. By the grace of God, men were able to sustain Christian social order with all of its defects for more than 1,500 years. And so what we need is a resurrection of that continuing miracle. And how will that happen? Well, we've been told how it will happen. And again, it isn't the traditionalists telling us this. You know, help is on the way. We're now getting support for our crackpot views from all kinds of sources that weren't heard from. Non-Catholic scholars, and in this case, we're talking about the miraculous reconstitution of Christendom. We're getting support from non-traditionalist Catholics who are recognizing that we need a miracle. And one of these is Antonio Socci. Antonio Socci, I did a book review of his latest book. He's a prolific Italian author, the host of an Italian television show. He's conducted press conferences for Cardinal Ratzinger and the current prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine and the Faith, Cardinal Bertone. This is one of the top 5 or 10 public intellectuals in Italy. He is no traditionalist, and yet, in setting out to refute the traditionalist analysis of the current crisis in the church and the world, he was overcome by it and surrendered to it, and is now an advocate for the message of Fatima as the means by which there will be a reconstitution of Christendom. And in his book, which unfortunately is not yet available in English, he speaks about the message of Fatima, and he says that God manifested his plan at Fatima to found the reign of Mary to save the world from auto-destruction, to save the church from disappearance, and humanity from eternal damnation. And then he goes on to say that, look, the consecration obviously hasn't been done. But the prophecy of what will happen when the consecration is done is, as he puts it, the announcement of a radical and extraordinary change in the world, an overthrow of the mentality dominating modernity, probably following dramatic events for humanity. And he also says that there's a striking parallel between what he believes to be contained in the missing part of the third secret of Fatima and the vision of Don Bosco. He believes, as traditionalists believe, and this is huge because this is a mainstream Italian celebrity with a television show saying these things now. He says that when the third secret is realized, we will see the fulfillment of Don Bosco's prophecy. You may have seen the depiction of the prophecy of Don Bosco in Keep the Faith's literature. The twin pillars, the Pope who succeeds a fallen Pope and succeeds in steering the church between the twin pillars of the Holy Eucharist and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, anchoring the church in safety at last and restoring the church. And Socci, God bless him for saying this, says that when the consecration is finally done, we will see, as he says, an overthrow of modernity and a victory greater than the victory of the church at Lepanto. It will be a world revolution. Well, we won't have a Garden of Eden, not everyone will convert, but there will be a fundamental change in humanity. He says probably following dramatic events for the world. It may unfortunately be the Third World War, which reminds you of an aspect of the visional part of the secret that we were given back in June of 2000. You see the Pope at the top of the hill being killed by a band of soldiers as he kneels before a cross. And this is very curious. They kill him with rifles and bows and arrows. Now, Albert Einstein says he doesn't know how the Third World War will be fought, but the Fourth World War will be fought with bows and arrows. Now, that's perhaps what Socci is talking about. It may take a world war to get us to the point where a Pope consecrates Russia, and we have that reversion. But it's inevitable, I believe, that we will see a reconstitution of Christendom before God rolls up the world like a scroll, as the Old Testament says, and puts it aside. And so that is our hope. The hope begins and ends with God and his Blessed Mother. And I think that when we see the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, the problems of modernity will disappear, at least for a time, and we will see the restoration that is the salvation of the West, failing which the West will no longer exist. So let's hope and pray that we see in our lifetime that consecration and the subsequent triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. For as she said, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Mr. Ferrara, I would say that as a pinch hitter, you delivered a game-winning hit here. Thank you very much. There is in the winter 2007 issue of the Latin Mass magazine, this cover, which may be out there, I think, in the lobby. Some of you, well, you've probably read it. There is a review of the book by Mr. Ferrara that he speaks of, and it's the most interesting story. So I would advise you to maybe pick up this copy of the magazine, or at least request a copy of this magazine.